Hi there, I'm Stacy, the encaustic mixed media artist behind Studio Stacy. Encaustic literally means to burn in. So I paint with beeswax and a torch, and because it's mixed media, pretty much anything else I can get my hands on. If you're new around here, welcome. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. Consider subscribing and joining this artsy community. Don't forget to hit that thumbs up button, which helps me get introduced to more like-minded artsy folks like yourself. Hi all. In the studio, as you can kind of see here, I have the encaustic wax turned on, and I thought I might go over a question that I probably get asked the most as an encaustic artist from other people doing encaustic, and that is that the wax is not going on the surface smoothly. The encaustic paint and or encaustic medium is not going on the surface smoothly. And I think that this can be especially tricky in the northern climates and colder climates in the wintertime. Now the weather here is starting to warm up. But regardless of how cold your studio is or the temperature is in the space that you're working in, I think these are tips and tricks that will hopefully be helpful to anyone running into this problem, and also just things to keep in the back of your mind as you're creating paintings. But before we jump into those tips and tricks, I thought I would flip the camera around here and show you what I'm going to be painting on. And this surface happens to be a surface that I use probably one of the surfaces that I use probably the most working with encaustic. All right, and that surface is a wood cradled panel. So it's a solid surface, and as you can see, it's cradled. There's no frame around it. It's just a wood cradled panel, and I have it prepped already with a few layers of RNF encaustic gesso. I feel like the encaustic gesso helps. Not everybody uses it, but I feel like it definitely helps, and you're just starting with a nice white clean surface this way. I also like to tape my edges here off with blue painter's tape, just to keep the edges nice and clean, this brown kind of edge here. I don't worry about this little tiny white edge. In fact, on that white edge, I typically like to leave the drips of wax on it, but I like to keep this surface clean and the back of the panel somewhat clean as well. So I use blue painter's tape for those. All right, now that you know what surface I'm painting on, let me show you the rest of the supplies. I have a griddle here with some melted encaustic medium in, two Hake brushes, two different sizes, a smaller one and a slightly larger one. And then on this griddle, which is also heated up nicely, I have this empty pan here, which I'll show you what I use that for. I don't always use it, but I'll show you that in a bit. And then I have another Hake brush. This happens to be my white one with some white encaustic paint in this tin, all melted down and ready to go. I should also say I have my torch, which is what I use to fuse things. I like a torch over a heat gun, but these same principles would apply if you were using a heat gun. All right, so tip number one has to do with heat and heating up the griddles specifically. So I came in here probably about an hour ago, turned on both of the griddles, got them heated up so the wax is definitely a paint. When I say wax, I mean encaustic wax, just to clarify that. I'm just kind of a general statement, but The wax on both of these griddles has been heating up for a while and is nicely melted. So you want to make sure, I have actually two different thermometers. I have a candy thermometer, which I have in the deeper griddle, and then I have just a surface thermometer on the other griddle. And that just lets me regulate the temperatures of both griddles because there's not an exact science to it. By this point in time, I know what temperatures I keep both of them at because I've been doing this for such a long time with these specific griddles. But if you're relatively new, or if you get a new griddle, you definitely want to have a surface thermometer and or a candy thermometer to double check the temperature of the wax. You don't want to get it too hot, as it can be toxic for you to breathe in if it kind of reaches a smoking point. Definitely not good. And you also want to make sure it's hot enough to work with. So that's tip number one. Get your wax or encaustic paint, encaustic medium, heat it up ahead of time so it's nice and melted, and also your brushes on the griddles or in the griddles so that they're nice and soft and pliable. All right, tip number two is to heat your panel, especially when you're applying the first couple layers. So if you were in the studio with me, I would have you touch this panel, but it's cooler to the touch. It's not warm by any stretch of the imagination. It's definitely cooler. It's not freezing because it's not freezing in here, but touch your surfaces. See if they're cold, are they warm? You want them just warm to the touch, because if you can imagine, if you're putting hot wax onto a cold surface, it's going to cool off even quicker as it goes across the surface. So tip number two, heat your surface up with either your torch or your heat gun. Now, if you have an especially large panel, or if it's an especially cold temperature in your studio space painting area, you may want to work in sections. This panel is not real big, but on my larger paintings, definitely for the first several layers of encaustic medium, and sometimes even into the first several layers of encaustic paint, I will work in sections, because by the time you get to the bottom of the panel, it could be cold. By the, once you heated up the top, it's now nice and warm, and by the time you get to the bottom, it's cold again. So work in sections, and then just, every time you go to put wax down on an area, excuse me, excuse me, just touch your panel and make sure that it is warm to the touch. You definitely always want it warm to the touch when you're trying to get a smooth surface. Textured surface is a whole nother ball game, but this is all about smooth surfaces and the wax gliding onto the panel. All right, and now that can you hear that bird out there? It's very loud. Anyways, it's springtime here. Anyways, now that this panel is nice and warm, tip, I can't remember if am I on 3, 4? Anyways, the next tip is to really load up your brush with encaustic medium. So, I mean, really dip it in there, scoop out a lot of paint, and make sure your brush is really loaded up. And don't let it like drip off. Like once you've got it loaded up on the panel, just come right over to your panel and stick that paint down, especially if it's a bigger panel, because that panel, and on the first layer, it's really gonna soak in all of that wax, which is what you want it to do. So if your brush isn't loaded up nicely, the first swipe, it's just gonna take up everything on the first, few inches of your panel. It's gonna soak into that board, and you're gonna keep going across the board, and you're not gonna have any wax left on the brush, or the wax that is left on the brush is gonna just come off in kind of clumps if it's not really loaded up nicely. All right, I think you could tell on that time lapse, but every time I put down a layer, I put my hand on the panel. Then I torch it. Then I put my hand on the panel again. So I'm just gauging the temperature of the panel the entire time, making sure it's warm but not too warm. And then the other thing I like to do with my panels is flip them around. Now, some artists say that gives them a checkerboard effect. I don't find that. But another tip is if you kind of had an idea of what you're going to paint on the panel, if you go in the same direction all the time that the painting is going to go in, that may help with that checkerboard effect. I don't find it that I get that in my panels, but if you are kind of getting that by flipping the panel all around, just go in the same direction. You know, you could just flip it twice, like 180 degrees all the way around, instead of flipping it on all four sides. I like to make sure that I have encaustic medium on all four sides, dripping down the sides, covering all of it, but you don't have to do that. So just make sure you have paint covering the entire, or encaustic medium covering the entire surface if that's what you're going for. Another thing I wanted to make sure I mentioned is that as you add more and more layers to this panel and keep working, it stays hotter and hotter, which is a good thing, but also you could get like hot points in the panel. So maybe you let your torch linger there just a couple more seconds than another area, and you definitely want to watch out for those, because if your panel isn't somewhat cooled off, if the wax hasn't solidified, what could happen is when you go over that area with a brush loaded up with wax, that wax could end up pulling off of that area, creating texture and a divot. And when you think your brush is actually skipping over the surface, it's not really skipping over the surface because it's too cool. It's skipping over the surface because it's too hot. So watch for hot points on your panel, and you can tell, you know, as that wax cools off, it gets a little less glossy, if you will. I'll try to flip the camera around and show you that. All right, I mentioned in the beginning that I would show you what this tray is for, and I don't really use these drip trays a lot, but if you have a large panel and you're taking your encaustic brush from one end of the panel all the way across to the other, you know, taking it out of the pan, coming over here, you could possibly drip across your panel. And then that drip, any little bump that gets on their surface, any little drip will cause texture on your surface, and you may or may not want that. Now, you can always take and scrape that drip away, but you could also take, and I can't do this while holding the camera, but I'll try to demonstrate it. You can take this drip tray along with your brush and carry it over to this end of the panel, swipe your brush across, and then you've caught any drips that are going to be possibly coming off your brush into the drip tray. Now, the other thing you can do with these clips is you can actually clip them onto your paint. Sorry, that was out of focus. You can clip these clips onto your paint, and then this is stuck a little bit. There we go. Take your paint over to your panel. Again, I don't typically do that. I find that if I take the paint off of the griddle, it cools off a bit more than what I would like it to. So I just leave my paint on the griddle and take my brush carefully around my painting to where I want to paint on the panel. So, you know, I might come this direction with the brush and then back this way. Hopefully all of that makes some sense. But these clips you can get at your local hardware store. I think they're called Bulldog clips, and they're quite strong. So they really clip onto things nicely, and they are handy to have. Obviously, I have them. This happens to be just some soy wax to clean my brush off with. Oh, that's the other thing. I have a red clip, so I know that this is my soy wax. This is my dirty paint cup, if you will. So I keep this clip on this so I know that it's actually not purple paint. It's dirty paint water, if you will, or dirty paint wax. Now I could leave this panel just like this and start laying down any color of paint that I wanted to. However, I like to lay down a couple colors of white paint with all of my paintings. I just think it just, to me, gives it a nice, clean, crisp white surface. You don't have to do that. It's just my personal preference. So I'm gonna put some white paint down on this. Basically the same steps that I've been doing with this clear encaustic medium, using the white paint to do that. And yeah, so I think probably put you on time lapse for this. And oh, I should show you one other tool. Hold please. All right, one other tool I forgot to mention is a good pair of tweezers. So this is handy because, especially with the natural bristle brushes, I find no matter how new or old they are, I'm always getting a few brush hairs in the wax. So I use these to just carefully pick out that brush hair. And they're really handy to have. As you can see, they are very well loved as they have a lot of drippy wax on them. But yes, a pair of tweezers are also nice and handy to have when you're trying to get a smooth surface. And you can pick out any other imperfections that may have accidentally landed in the panel with these. All right, I wanted to show you one thing. I think you can see there's a little divot here. And I may have just skipped over that area at one point in time, or I might have heated it up a little bit too much and got like a little extra hot spot and a divot there. So what you can do for that is you can take your paint and just get it on the brush here and then drip it into those divot or holes. All right, one more thing I thought of. So sometimes the edges can get a little bit more of a buildup than the rest of your panel. And that's just because you're taking your brush off and you might be kind of flicking more paint off at the end. It's really common, not unusual. But if you don't kind of take care of that on the first couple layers, it will continue to build up on those edges. So a loop pottery tool, one like this, you can get these at most craft stores and or order them online, but it's just, I think they're called a loop pottery tool. You can use this to just lightly scrape away at those edges. Just really lightly. You want the wax to be a little bit warm, not too hot though, because it's really easy to scrape down to nothing with this, but you can see it just takes up just a little bit of that wax edge there. I think you can see that on there, and it just smooths out all of your edges. And then you do want to fuse that area down again with the torch just to make sure it's all fused in that area you just scraped back. Then the very last thing I like to do is kind of get down at the painting level, kind of at the edge of the painting, and really look over the surface to see if I see any other imperfections. Because most of my paintings, you probably know, have a lot of texture in them, but there are areas in most of my paintings that also are very smooth. So I like to start out with a nice smooth surface before adding in texture. That way I don't accidentally get some texture in an area where I might not want the texture. And I think it's good practice to try to get a nice smooth edge. And yeah, hopefully these tips were helpful for you all, but let me get down, take a look at this painting and make sure there's no other imperfections that I want to kind of just tweak a little bit to get a smoother surface. All right, I think I am good with this first several layers of painting. I hope this was helpful for you. And I think the biggest tip is to get like up close and personal with your paintings here. Like touch the painting, feel the painting. Does it have like a nice warm surface? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? I think it's one of the beautiful things about encaustic is that even at art shows, I'm encouraging people to like touch the paintings. You don't have to be precious about encaustic, and the nice thing about it is it's dry in an instant. So you can definitely touch the paintings and yeah, just get to know your paintings, I guess that's what I would say. So if you have any other questions, definitely leave them down below in the comments if you have any questions about what I'm using, the tools, any of this stuff, or if you have any more tips and tricks for other artists about how to get a smooth surface, leave those down below. If you have experienced any problems with the wax cooling off too quickly or the brush not gliding over the surface, let us know what you did to solve that problem. And if you have any other questions or concerns, any other techniques that you want me to go over, let me know that too. I love kind of interacting with you all, and I like when you all have questions because it gives me ideas of videos to create. So at any rate, I think we'll probably leave you here with this one. Thanks so very, very, very much for following along. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If it gave you any tips or tricks, give it a thumbs up. Truly do appreciate it. If you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. And thanks again. We'll see you on the next one. Bye for now.